going to the saltwater world now. Mark Spalding is, where's Mark? There he is. Hi, Mark. Mark Spalding is the senior marine scientist with the global marine team of the Nature Conservancy, and his case study he's going to give us is from the marine world, I'm assuming. It's all yours, sir.
Thanks very much. So I'm kind of giving two halves to this. I'm giving two halves to this. So I'm starting off, continuing the theme of the last presentation of Ali, but taking us to the marine world. As Ali said, there's not been so much done on the marine world, so I'm going to start off focusing on biodiversity, and then I'm going to rapidly rush off stage, change hats, and come back and talk about ecosystem services. So first off, I want to think about marine biodiversity, current status, trends, and where we're going. Ali gave us a nice overview of the fact there is a lot of information out there helping us to understand patterns of biodiversity. I've just put a few maps up here. We know less about the marine environment, but there's still quite a lot. So you can see on here, we've got over on the right, we've got mangrove species range maps from which we can get these biodiversity sort of hotspot type maps. There, bottom right is the hotspots produced by Callum Roberts about 10 years ago for coral reef hotspots. Top left is eco-regional units that have been devised for the marine environment, and bottom left is the EBSAs, the ecologically and biologically sensitive areas that have been set up through the CBD to identify real areas of needed concentration for conservation effort. To add to this, and building very much on this body of knowledge, a new paper is on its way. It's under review still, but some elements of it were released. Here, Stuart Butchart gave a presentation on this on Saturday, and I'm just going to summarize the marine components of this. Quite a bit of overlap with some of Ali's work, but what we did, and there's a huge list of authors you can see on the bottom there, was to take both some of these ecological maps of ecoregions and so on, but also species range maps to try and look at where we were in terms of protecting biodiversity. It's a pretty complex slide, so I'll try and talk you through it. So the graphic shows the top 4 bars show progress in terms of these eco-regional units. Green is where we've met the target. Now remember, it's only 10% for marine settings. So you can see that for marine ecoregions, we've hit 32% of the world's marine ecoregions have hit that 10% target. Blue means they're part way, and red means they haven't got anywhere at all. So you can see there's a long way to go. And then the lower set of bars represent the species range maps. Now there's now thousands of species range maps, pretty comprehensive range maps for these groups. So you've got fishes, corals, some of the crustaceans, mangroves and seagrasses are in there too. A pattern's emerging here which is quite different from terrestrial, and you can see that none of them have met a sufficient part of their range within protected areas, but actually there's quite a high proportion have fairly substantial coverage. The big gaps that we know about, well, we're at 3% of the marine environment overall within MPAs, so it has gone up a lot since the 2012 publication that Harvey mentioned, but that's still way, way short of Aichi. And of course the big gap is in the pelagic and the high seas in particular. We can also use the data behind all of this work to start looking at trends, where we've come from, where we're going, and you can see that since the 90s we've seen a doubling in terrestrial area of protected areas, but a 5-fold increase in marine protected areas. So there's been a massive increase in marine protected areas, and the trajectory is looking quite good, which is perhaps cause for hope, but of course the starting point was so darn low that anything could look good against that. So just a few points on that. Sorry, that's just to show how big these collaborations get. Those are the partners in that project. So I just wanted to think a couple of recommendations around the marine biodiversity point. Now, I think there's a few things that I really want to draw attention to. We need to address some of these huge gaps, this 0.2% of the world's high seas within protected areas is clearly an urgent area for focus and attention. We need to hit that. We also need better data, and it's an awful thing for scientists to always stand up and say better data, but it is remarkable how little we know and can even make these measurements. There's no global map of the world's salt marshes. Now, salt marshes are in the most developed countries. Countries individually have maps. No one's put them together. There's no global map, so I can't tell you what proportion of the world's salt marshes or seagrasses or volcanic vents or so many other habitats. We don't know how well protected they are. We have very little means to get there. And we need to improve the species range maps, and we need to improve the tools by which we can help people prioritize. Is that 5 to go? I've had 5. I've got 50. I don't know where I am. Okay, and then the second sort of slide of some of my recommendations is actually inspired by Aichi target. We need to think about the other measures that are called for in Aichi targets as protected areas and other effective area-based means, and we need to think where that came from. A lot of it was inspired by the fisheries people who were saying, yeah, well, we don't just want you to count MPAs. We need to think as a community and discuss, well, what does that mean? Are some of these fisheries management areas acceptable to us? And how do we build those into our planning? We need to think about effectiveness, not just in terms of numbers of staff or budgets or boats, but we need to think of effectiveness in terms of ecological effectiveness, and that's what some of these area-based tools that Ali was talking about get to. And I think in this we need, as a marine community, to give special attention to no-take, because frankly the mess of stuff that is classed as a marine protected area is all over the shop, and some of it's doing very little at all. No-take is a fairly solid standard which we can build upon, and I think we should be thinking about targets for no-take. And we need to think about how this sits in a wider framework. And I think there's a heck of a lot of progress being made on marine spatial planning and ocean zoning, and I think it behoves this protected areas audience to think about how we embed ourselves in that wider landscape. And I think it would be great if the Sydney Promise can get beyond platitudes towards actual quantified numbers. I've suggested some targets here, but I'm very happy for a debate to ensue. I think even for 2020 we could probably have a target for no take, but pushing forwards we can have interim targets and these aspirational goals, which, and I don't know how that sits in comparison to the nature needs half. Is that an aspirational goal? But we need some interim targets as well. So at this point I was going to run off stage, change into a sharp suit, and come back looking like an Australian politician with a sharp tie and a slick hairdo, but I don't have time. So now I'm going to talk about ecosystem services, and I think there's, just to introduce this, I'm talking now, taking my marine hat off. I want to set a scene about ecosystem services, and I'm going to go back to marine. The reason why I made that possibly silly quip about changing into a suit was because I think there is a bit of a debate going on in the conservation community about between, if you like, an extreme, the traditionalists who think of nature conservation as being all about forests and landscapes and wetlands and so on, and this movement which has sometimes been called the neo-conservation movement. And although I disagreed strongly, I loved a recent presentation by George Monbiot, which translated these terms for us into the following. We no longer talk about nature, we talk about natural capital. We no longer talk about green infrastructure, forests, we talk about green infrastructure. Biodiversity and habitats become asset classes in an ecosystem's market. Okay? I think this is actually a completely false dichotomy, but it's an interesting comparison. I think in fact, if we look at it, nature conservation and ecosystem services have a very long tradition. Thinking back top left to the role of Pacific Islanders in setting aside areas, going back probably thousands of years. Bottom right, the New Forest in the UK is possibly the oldest protected area. It was set aside in 1067 by William the Conqueror as a hunting reserve. Bottom left, you can see why the Yellowstone National Park was set aside as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So I think there's a long tradition. There's also a commitment to take ecosystem services seriously. under IG, we talked about biodiversity and ecosystem services, and they were given equal weight. And I think we sometimes forget that. But I think there's also a very strong incentive for us to start grasping ecosystem services. This is a graphic, came from a World Bank report, which talks about the value of mangroves in Thailand, and uses an economic argument. If you start using the economic arguments back, you can start to make some powerful statements. So this took out the government subsidies, and look what happened to the value of mangroves, converted mangroves. It dropped enormously. If you then put in the values, some of the other ecosystem services values of mangroves, you suddenly see a very compelling case for doing conservation. I probably don't have time for many more graphics on this, but there's some really interesting work going on in the mangrove world, which I know quite well. Working with Wetlands International, with engineers and local people. We're restoring mangroves in northern Java, where you've got a rapidly eroding coast. The only reason we're going ahead with it is because the local people have agreed to set aside these restored mangroves as protected areas. Otherwise, they'd turn them back into shrimp ponds. It would be pointless. Also, big new investments. New money is coming in through, for example, blue carbon investments. This is conservation finance. And it's kind of exciting new stuff. And I think there's also a disconnect between some of us, the more traditional conservation people, and the whole world of ecosystem service valuation that's building up. Mapping tools and quantification is somehow not getting through to all in the protected areas world. Although I was really pleased to see the Protected Planet report, the latest edition, is starting to ask how well are we doing in terms of protecting ecosystem services. So the last little piece, I'm going to try and, I think I probably need to speed up, talks about ecosystem services within marine protected areas. This is me back with my marine hat on again. And a couple of years ago now, we published a report in Ocean Yearbook, which had me asking the question, well, how well are we doing in terms of protecting ecosystem services in the ocean? And we didn't have a metric. But I figured, and I think others have agreed with me, that one of the key drivers of value is proximity to people. Not all ecosystem services are a result of people being close to the ecosystem, but many are. It's local take for fisheries, it's local protection from storms. And so this plot, which appeared to show an inverse relationship between coastal population densities and marine protected areas coverage, got us thinking. We also found that we could produce a global map of ecosystem services. This was the first paper we came up with, which was a map of mangrove biomass. And from that, we started to, we got support to do a new project, and you're seeing some preliminary results here for the first time today, which was supported by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, multiple partners in Cambridge, to look at how well coral reef and mangrove ecosystem services fall under the Protected Areas Network. So we had these images, if you like, and we turned them into maps. I haven't got time to explain how we turned them into maps, but the maps aren't bad. They're kind of heat maps, if you like. At a global scale, I think they work. And we then asked, well, what proportion of these services fall under protected areas? Here's some quick results. So 32% of the world's coral reefs fall within protected areas. It's one of the better protected ecosystems on the planet. But only 17% of their value in terms of coastal protection falls within protected areas. Tourism value is pretty well covered by protected areas, and we can probably start to understand why, because they're important economically and governments have seen that. And fisheries values fall in between. I'll just dive in a little bit with a map here. Now, this is Hawaii, and of course Hawaii with its vast Papahānaumokuākea marine protected area has 88% of its coral reefs fall within protected areas. But if you zoom in just a little bit, you'll see that, so I've zoomed in on the box, the statistics are still the total Hawaii statistics. About 40% of the fisheries value falls within protected areas. 22% of the tourism value and only 15% of the coastal protection value. And it's probably not surprising. The picture in the bottom right shows Waikiki, Honolulu, fronted by coral reefs. Those coral reefs, although probably very degraded, are probably still providing an important coastal protection service, but they haven't been targeted by the protected areas community. There's a little bit more about this. I can unfold a bit more of the results, and I've got those 2 sessions tomorrow where you might, if you want to hear more, or you can look up the report. And I just want to have really just this last slide of recommendations. Everyone is talking about ecosystem services. The number of sessions here on local community, locally managed marine areas, on RED, on tourism, the industry, many industries are represented here. We're all talking about it, but we need to turn it into tools that can help us firstly achieve Aichi, because Aichi, we made that commitment, but secondly, go beyond Aichi. We need tools to help us to quantify and map. We need metrics, and I think those metrics should not just be monetary. I'm worried about using just monetary metrics. I think we need to think about livelihoods, food security, coastal protection, jobs. There are many other, even votes actually. Votes would be a very powerful metric if we could get it. I think we also need to focus. I think some of the talk about potential future values and non-use values doesn't hold much sway with many economists, and I think we could do ourselves a great service by focusing, to start with at least, on these very high value services. I'd like to think that we can get something equivalent to EBSAs in the marine environment for ecosystem services. So EBSAs are these ecologically and biologically important areas. How about areas of critical importance for ecosystem services, driven by data, but refined by expert input? And we need to act fast, because we've got a commitment for 2020 to protect ecosystem services, and we don't have the metrics to do it. Thinking about nature needs half, it's a great idea. I'm worried that it perpetuates this division between people and nature. I would like to think that we also have another strapline, which is humans need nature. So that's my last slide. A lot of this work is funded by a project called Mapping Ocean Wealth, and it's a huge partnership. Thank you.